seminar.
No. Just there is another scholar who's named Federico Leoni, and I wanted to make sure the book of Kapoor is yours, right? You just published it,
Yeah,
or
yeah. Mm-hmm.
perfect, because it
Seminar.
looked like something you could
No, no,
write.
no. But
I wanted to make
is he a scholar, my homonymous? Because I think he is a journalist,
I believe it's
especially in U.S. Politics and the economic situation of U.S.
I believe
And
there are
he wrote some.
We are
And
live.
are
let
you in
me
contact with him?
okay, because that could be three then.
Okay, so I think
Because
we are live now. So Alex, you can please introduce our speaker. Yeah.
yeah, perfect. And so, if it's okay for you, Federico, we are going to start right now.
Mhm. Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone to this meeting of the seminar cycle Made Singular. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris, and I'm here with Gregory Scott Moss. We are organizing this seminar series. The discussion has been going on for almost a year now, and we are quite excited. We are already planning the calendar for the second year of this seminar series, and but much has already been put on the plate. And today we have the great pleasure of having with us Federico Leoni from the University of Verona. He's professor of moral philosophy. He's an expert of contemporary French philosophy, and he works at the crossroad between psychoanalysis, philosophy, and contemporary art. He's written many books. I won't remember them here. A recent publication of on Anish Kapoor, book on Henri Bergson, and the title of his contribution today is very exciting. It's Singularities, or How to Make Things Without Substance. I won't say anything for you. There is much to say, I'm sure. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, Gregory, and all the friends and people who are attending the seminar. I will begin recalling a famous short story by Jorge Luis Borges, who staged in this short story a quite mythical and fable-like China, yet less crazy and less maybe imaginary than Borges would have us to believe, and maybe more necessary to us than ever. We can maybe learn some lesson from this fabulous Borgesian China. The secret idiom of John Wilkins, this is the title of the story, the secret idiom of John Wilkins, tells us about an obscure German scholar, certain Franz Kuhn, in whose work mention would be made of an even more obscure and unspecified Chinese encyclopedia. And the encyclopedia would classify animals into the following categories. A, belong to the emperor. B, embalmed. C, domesticated. D, suckling pigs. E, mermaids. F, fabulous. G, dogs at large. H, included in the present classification. I, meddling, flailing about. J, drawn with a very fine brush of camel hair. L, etc. M, that have just broken the pot. N, that from a distance look like flies. So I would like to make some methodological consideration, first of all, about how not to neutralize the Chinese encyclopedia by Borges. We all know that in the 20th century philosophy, Borges' short story has known and illustrious philosophical history. It is known that Michel Foucault took his cue from it to launch a vast inquiry to which he would give the title The Words and the Things, or in the English standard translation, The Order of Things. And in the introduction of the book, Foucault evokes the Chinese encyclopedia as the very birthplace of his research. And he points to the laughter that shakes us at its reading as what would question, he says, and this is his words, our millennia-old practice of the same and the other. And he adds at some point that what that laughter shakes is the consistency of the space in which those bizarrely classified animals should be able to consist. And the folly of strangeness of the classification would not, in fact, lie in the individual categories. There are domesticated animals, there are animals which are painted with camel brushes, and mermaids also exist, at least if we establish that to exist means to be present in certain texts, in a certain tradition, imaginary, and so on. Nor it is true that the folly or the strangeness of the classification lies in the paradox of the etc. or the included in the present classification, things that Foucault dismisses somewhat quickly, I think, by referring back to well-known paradoxes, he says. I think the strangeness, or maybe Foucault thinks the strangeness, on the contrary, lies in the absence of a common space. This is his words. Common space, the absence of a common space in which those beings should coexist. In the case of the Chinese encyclopedia, that space of cohabitation, being would be reduced to the simple sequence of alphabetical letters indicating the different categories, Foucault says. And it is from this sense of estrangement that Foucault derives and begins his inquiry. And if we find it impossible to think about this universe that the Chinese encyclopedia puts before our eyes, the use we must make of this impossibility will be, according to Foucault, will be self-critical, autobiographical, autogenealogical. The Chinese encyclopedia, says Foucault, would confront us with that delimitation which is our own. We find our way of classifying beings so familiar, but we also are strange, we also are exotic, we also are prisoners of the false evidence of equally fanciful criteria. We also are dazzled by an obviousness that we should learn to question, to interrogate. So what Foucault announces is, I think, in short, an entirely negative program. It is about suspending the course of our habitual mode of constituting the world. The old Husserl echoes in the Foucauldian gesture. And even more, it is the old Kant, which is somewhat evoked by Foucault gesture. What is the a priori of this way we judge the world, of this way of articulating the universe according to this system of identities and differences, rather than other systems of identities and differences. So at this point, allow me a digression, which I do not begin without having consulted some friends who know much more than I do about Chinese and Oriental languages. A digression on what we should call the Sino-Japanese classifiers. The scholars have labored around a few traces Borges offers us about his encyclopedia. Borges says he drew on the writing of that Franz Kuhn, whom I already mentioned, a German translator of Chinese texts into English, now almost unknown. And some have pursued, for example, an Italian comparatist, Paolo Cherchi, has pursued this thread of Franz Kuhn, landing on Kuhn's writings and the Chinese encyclopedias that Kuhn must have studied or consulted, encyclopedias that actually exist and actually are marked by criteria that the Western eye, the Western mentality finds quite bizarre. But I think we should add to this investigation of literary sources, of philological sources, a consideration of linguistic nature. Those encyclopedia, those encyclopedic criteria that we find bizarre are in a way rooted in a circumstance which is related to the working of the Chinese language, and also the Japanese language. Or perhaps I may add, are rooted in a way of life that finds exemplary expression in the working of those languages, and which is not by chance found also in the encyclopedias which are compiled and are written in those languages. There are in those languages some particles called classifiers, which intervene whenever it is necessary to number a certain object or a certain quantity of objects. And those classifiers serve to, so to speak, to preliminarily explicate a kind of category to which those objects we are about to evoke belong. Imagine, for example, that we have to say an umbrella, or a gun, or a plate, a sheet of paper. We will not use that numeral A1 without adding a classifier, that is, a particle that clarifies that we are numbering, however, a long and narrow thing, in the case of the umbrella, or a flat and thin thing, in the case of the plate. And it is as if we are never dealing with the same one umbrella, an umbrella, one sheet of paper, a sheet of paper. And it is one thing to say that we are dealing with a unitary and yet long and narrow thing, and in the case, an umbrella. And it is another quite different thing to say that we are dealing with a unitary and yet flat and thin thing, as in the case of the sheet of paper. But what is most peculiar, however, is the list of things we find united by the same classifier. One of them, that of the flat and thin things, applies to plates, sheets of paper, photographs, rafts, garments, dresses. Another That of long and narrow things applies to rivers, roads, ties, bottles, trains, umbrellas, movies, and there are many others, dozens of them, all functioning similarly, all relating to sets of objects we Europeans would never put together. It is a quite Borgesian world, the one that opens up before us when we read the list of the object we are to put in a common space on the basis of their classifier. Wouldn't we rather want to put ties and garments together and in another sphere, in another box, to gather means of transportation, for example, rafts and trains? But these counterexamples set us, I think, already set us on a different path. We understand immediately that it all depends on the trait we want to highlight from time to time, the trait that concerns us most at a given moment or in a given situation, context. The decisive thing, in short, is that magical moment when the trait is identified. Things flat and thin, things long and narrow, things painted with very fine brushes, things that look like flies from a certain distance, and so on and so on. Who knows, it might be interesting with respect to some purpose we can not imagine at present to traverse the vast world by gathering all the things that from a distance look like flies, distinguishing them from all those that do not. In any case, decisive is the moment when a certain trait takes prominence, and in consequence of its taking prominence, a more general thing also takes prominence, a category corresponding to that trait, that, for example, of all things that from a distance look like flies. And always in consequence of this, a certain particular thing or a certain set of particular things are drawn into the orbit of that general thing, becoming its particular objects, its particular representatives, its objects. The trait, thus, is neither a particular nor a universal, but something as a power that circulates through both fields by relating them, or power which circulates through the world, so to speak, by articulating it in certain universals and in the particulars of those certain universals. So, let us now try to put this first landscape into perspective. If every journey begins by taking off from home, our journey towards Borgesian China will begin by examining our bewilderment as Westerners before the Borgesian Encyclopedia, the Chinese Borgesian Encyclopedia. Under A, we find animals that belong to the emperor. At B, we should find animals that do not belong to the emperor, but to others. At that point, C should indicate a division within those others. For example, the empress or the court dignitaries, and so on. What happens in short in a Western encyclopedia? It is that from time to time we choose a trait, we also choose a trait that for some reason interests us. For example, the affiliation of animals to the emperor. So we elevate the trait to the status of a point of view about the whole set of animals, and we begin to collect in a first set the animals that possess it. And that at that point, we find that a second set has been produced, the set of animals that do not possess it. We could say that neither the first set, neither the second set possesses the trait. It is the trait that indicates the animals of the first set as possessing the first set. And it is the trait that indicates the animals of the second set as not possessing the trait. On that second set, we repeat the same operation. We Westerners, we European, we Greek, the same operation. If those animals do not belong to the emperor, they will perhaps belong to the empress. In short, we Westerners, we hold, we maintain the trait. We think that the trait is objective, that the trait is stable, that the trait is independent of our whims or state of minds, that the trait belongs to being. The result of this idea, of this conviction, is in projection what is known in the West as the Porphyrian tree. As soon as we consider an encyclopedia that talks about animals, we immediately think that not only the set of animals that belong to the emperor is a subset of animals, but that animals are also a subset of something larger, for example, that of living things, which also include plants, for example. And then we think that living beings are also a subset of something even broader, for example, that of beings that simply have the property of being, or rather the property of being in general, or rather being itself in general, that simply is in general. Thus, we have that in a first direction, we will be led to postulate the existence of gradually more substantial branches, up to that enormous trunk that would be the being that unites all beings in their pure and simple fact of being. But the tree also moves in the opposite direction. And in the opposite direction, we shall be led to postulate the perpetual thinning of the branches and ultimately fraying into a vast frond of twigs made of increasingly subtler attributes, animals that belong to the emperor, but the emperor that day is dressed in dark green, and it was a Sunday morning. And the entity, the individual substance, the thing in its singularity, will consist wholly and exclusively in a kind of geometric place, a geometric locus, which can be circumscribed by following the many divisions of the trunk along the line that moves between the most general being and the most particular attribute, the most universal and the most particular, and by stopping somewhere along the tree at a certain intermediate point. But it is quite evident that that geometrical locus is absolutely unstable. To stand, to dwell there is ultimately quite impossible. It is the price to be paid for wanting to hold the trait steady, to fix it. The tree will draw a double movement rather than a double direction, and the double movement will plummet, so to speak, simultaneously toward the top and toward the root, toward the absolute universality of being, and toward the absolute particularity of the single, of the particular entity. And every singularity will, that is, be divided and postponed with a kind of hasty ferocity toward those opposite extremes. They alone will seem to be endowed with some truth or consistency. And of each singularity, it will seem to be necessary to say something quite liquidating. For example, that it is nothing more than the intersection between an always somewhat broader being and an always somewhat narrower specification. And even of that broader being and narrower specification, it will seem to be, in fact, to be said that it is nothing but the intersection between an even broader region tending toward totality and an even narrower specification tending toward the inexistent. And the singularity, in the final analysis of the singularity, there will be no trace, no rest. And the geometric locus of singularity will always be empty. So I think now it is the moment to move towards China, or at least toward the fabulous, the imaginary, the somewhat crazy China of the great Borges. The China's encyclopedia, it is quite clear, it proceeds differently. After identifying the animals belonging to the emperor, the encyclopedist immediately loses any interest in examining the other animals under that same profile of belonging to anyone. There is a magnificent, so to speak, discontinuity of his gaze. He jumps to a whole other category, and then he jumps again, domesticated animals, suckling pigs, and so on. And the encyclopedist, in other words, changes trait with each division and never divides the same substance. He changes traits with each division and therefore never divides the very same substance. Indeed, he seems to avoid the very principle of division, of the division between having such trait and not having such trait, between belonging to the emperor and not belonging to the emperor. The encyclopedist enunciates a set of animals that have the trait, and since he immediately changes the trait, he immediately moves to something else. He never lets us find next to the animals that have the trait those that do not. We find other animals that have a whole other trait, a trait that was never before mentioned. And the result is very interesting. The result is that the Chinese encyclopedia only shows us positive sets, positive ensembles, never negative sets, negative ensembles. It tells us about a universe that is full, unaware of lack, because it is from side to side unstable and fluctuating, and so lacking that it completely ignores the need to solidify those possible lacks within appropriate boxes. The lack is everywhere, so and therefore the lack is missing everywhere. So let's come back to Borges' text. Animals that belong to the emperor, animals that look like flies from afar. It is not that there are only differences without genus, only differences without species. It is not that there are only species without differences. It is not that there is no articulation, just because there is no lack, just because there is no negation. We find precisely animals that belong to the emperor, or animals that from a certain distance, look like flies. It is as if every time some division is operating, but the division is always momentary. We could try to read in this way those categories we have already evoked so many times. Animals, but which belong to the emperor, or animals, but which from some distance look like flies. It is true that immediately we move on to something else, that is, the branch on which we are placed does not, so to speak, have enough time to generate a negative ramification. Animals, but which do not belong to the emperor. Animals, but which from a distance do not look like flies. And yet it is equally true, I think, and equally important, I think, that a kind of internal branching is produced. Something like a doubling instead of a division. A doubling which does not become a division, but is a doubling. Or I could say an incipient bifurcation that does not come to be a bifurcation, that remains an incipient bifurcation. This is the sense of that but, which I have tried to introduce, animals but which belong to the emperor. It is, I think, as if a particularity produced its generality, but the generality lasted only the time of its particularity. Not more, not less, just the time of its particularity, and was not at all capable of becoming a more general past, not at all capable of presenting itself or establishing itself as a stable or absolute past. It is as if that briefly elicited generality does not come to offer a solid ground within which to carve out different species, further species, negative species in particular. Rather, we have a carving out procedure that simultaneously generates its substance and its accident, its matter and its form, and then erases itself. And the game begins again elsewhere. Is this a universe without common space, to use Foucault's words? Is it a universe without common space? I would say yes and no. Yes and no. It is a universe in which there are common spaces. There are common spaces, but only momentary ones. It is a universe in which a certain trait emerges, draws a brief common space, draws a space of its own that is basically every time all the space that there is, all the space or the matter or the past or the universal which is possible to draw. It is a universe of events that simultaneously carve out the being of that entity and the entity of that being, and immediately disappears. Immediately or almost immediately, not without drawing precisely the substance of that accident and the accident of that substance, the matter of that form and the form of that matter, not without that event being, so to speak, distributed each time on the twofold but unique momentary plane of a quasi-accident and a quasi-substance. These are maybe disposable substances and disposable accidents, or rather brief accident-substance couplings that seem to emerge from nothingness and seem to quickly plunge back into nothingness. Maybe the strange idea, the strange Western idea of the ex nihilo creation of things and of the universe, the strange idea which periodically bursts into a culture such as Western one, European one, so obsessed with the root of the Porphyrian tree and its promise of consistency. Maybe this strange idea of the ex nihilo has to do precisely with the need to think about the singularity of these momentary accident-substance couplings, so radically devoid of history and project, of past and future. Think of the creation of the biblical God, that the biblical God would operate from the bottom of a chaos close to non-being. Think of the destruction and reconstruction of the universe that the Cartesian God would accomplish at every moment. What is, we could ask this kind of question, what is the phantom of creation ex nihilo all about? Why does this phantom, in the psychoanalytic sense of the phantom, why does this phantom return so often, so constantly in our culture, in our theology, for example? Perhaps this phantom of the ex nihilo arises from the need to express, I would say this way, it arises from the need to express from within the language and the sensibility of Greek, Jewish, and Christian culture that scandalous vision of experience, of the momentary substance, momentary accidents, of the momentary substance accident coupling, of the singularity. I mean, I would say that that vision of experience comes to us in a version, that of creation ex nihilo, that is both deformed and traumatic. Deformed because it is filtered through the wrong words, through words from which one should take leave, probably, and traumatic, because only this excess, this violence, could perhaps allow that almost formless vision to shake the Porphyrium tree from its tragic stillness, consistency. But that vision, that experience comes to us, and it comes to us precisely in this deformed and traumatic version of the ex nihilo. I would say almost in the symptomatic form of the ex nihilo. And to those who know how to listen to it, it sweeps away the illusion of the matter of one single universe that would be given since the dawn of time, of the unbroken continuity of causality that would run along a single timeline, always homogeneous to itself. It does away with the illusion of common space, of a space which is common once and for all the times. Yet it does not speak of the simple absence. The phantom of the ex nihilo does not speak of the simple absence of common space, of substance, of past, of generality. It speaks of a momentariness, of a momentary character of the common, of an occasionality of space, of an eventuality of time. Here we must proceed quickly and crudely, I fear. It is quite evident that creation ex nihilo, both in Hebrew version and the Christian Cartesian version, is only partly creation from nothing, since it is also, and just as evidently, a creation operated by that gesture which extracts matter and form and things and events from nothing, ex nihilo. A gesture that in both cases, the biblical passage as the Cartesian theology, put on God's account, as if to signify the extraneousness of the gesture with respect to that nothingness, as if to reject that nothingness in a subordinate dimension. The nothingness will at best be a mirror of that gesture. It will be an inverted figure of it, a kind of grimace of that gesture. It will never be a matter of believing in the nothingness, in nihilo, in its grimace, but of deciphering it, because its contours are the contours of God, because nothingness is a kind of grimace of God's gesture, or a lieutenant of God's gesture. Here, I think, again, the Chinese encyclopedia helps us. Ruling the universe of the Chinese encyclopedia is not being, and is not nothingness or void, but it is the trait or the gesture of tracing, the gesture of extracting the trait. We could call gesture of tracing, the raising of a certain trait to a point of view on the whole of animals, for example. We could call gesture of tracing, the imposition of a certain trait to our attention, or to the attention of something in the universe, being painted with very fine brushes of camel hair, getting madly agitated to resemble flies from afar. So it may be said that there is also something that serves as a background to the emergence of that trait. And it is not from nothing, it is not ex nihilo that the category of the animal that moves wildly emerges, but from the broader category of animals that simply move, or from the even broader category of animals that simply live. You see, step by step, the Porphyrian will to consistency resurfaces. The hope that the tree has a trunk and roots resurfaces. But isn't it clear that even this category which is more general each time, this matter which is more and more universal each time, response is the effect, is the counterpart to the trait that we have chosen each time, to a characteristic that we have each time elevated to the status of the point of view on beings. If we were to say that all beings were shaped from clay, or were drawn from chaos, wouldn't this clay and this chaos also be an image, a distorted mirror, a sort of hypostasis of our ongoing gesture, of our action, of our event? That hypostasis, in other terms, is each time identifiable because it responds to a certain form of attention, to a certain practice of making vases, and so on. It is the objectification, the materialization, the substantiation of it. Thus, one can regress toward even more original matters, or rather, one can cultivate the illusion of regressing towards even more original matters, which is to say, towards even more general substances, or toward even more common and comprehensive spaces, or times for that matter. But it will not be a matter of ever more original matters at all. It will rather be a matter of ever different matters, and always different because corresponding to always different traits. In other words, what the West has thought of as nothing is the inverted mirror of what it has thought of as God. But we must take a step further and say that what the West has thought of as God is what the Chinese encyclopedia, avoiding the temptation of substantiation, of subjectivation, of hypostatization, has identified as a trait, as the gesture of tracing, as the tracing structure of every form of attention, of experience, of practice, of living, and indeed of every event, human, animal, vegetal, mineral, of every kind of event. Every kind of event is a trace taking place, is a gesture of tracing. So the formula of ex nihilo is the symptom, we could say, the psychoanalytic symptom that from within the Greek, Hebrew, Christian ontology tries to express, deforming it and displacing it and distorting it with violence the possibility of substituting ontology with something I would call ichnology. Ichnology. We can evoke with this word, with this term, a general theory or a general practice of the traits or of the tracing of the traits. So, and I'm approaching a conclusion, I would propose some final consideration on what we could call the importance of the letter H. Here, I think we can touch the importance, which is not dismissible as a well-known logical paradox, to use Foucault's words, of the letter H of the Chinese Borgesian encyclopedia, included in the present classification, and also the importance of the letter L, etc. It is a sort of momentary slap in the face, and maybe it could not be anything else, because it concerns something that cannot be thematized, but only evoked marginally, only observed by the corner of one's eye. The Chinese encyclopedia is not a device that allows us to look out over a certain landscape in relation to which we would be the spectators, and the landscape would be the theme of our observation, of our knowledge, of our experience, of our attention. There is no bird's eye view in the word of the Chinese encyclopedia. There is no separate point of view. It is the Porphyrian tree that allows a bird's eye view, or that creates the illusion of the bird's eye view. In the encyclopedia of Borges' tale, there is no common space. This continuous baseline should never be forgotten. In the Chinese encyclopedia, on closer inspection, so to say, there is each time one and only space, and that space is always the space triggered by a trait, by a gesture of tracing, by an event which is in progress, in action, elevating, looking like flies, or being embalmed, or belonging to the emperor, to a decisive feature, to a point of view on the universe. More generally, we could say that the tracing that is in place, that is ongoing, that is in progress, here is the gesture of the encyclopedist. Someone, as Merleau-Ponty says, opens his mouth and says, animals are divided into. And every time, in fact, in the world, in the universe, there is someone saying something. There is someone doing something. There is someone or something acting and gesturing and taking place. And in one way or another, as a result of that gesture, that event that taking place isolates a certain trait, elevates it to a point of observation, makes it the cornerstone of its construction of the world, makes it the lever on which to make force. that someone or something is every time the center of the universe, is every time the center from which the universe arranges itself as a universe. This is the very point which is implied in the H letter and the L letter of the list. Or even better, that someone or something is the universe itself, which other universes within which other universes together precipitate and rise, swarm and dissolve. So that all animals are indeed included in the present classification, included those who belong to the etc. That is, who are excluded from it because they are the exact complement of the included, and who therefore are included, though excluded, that is precisely because they are excluded. The only thing properly excluded, the only great outside that the Chinese encyclopedia admits, is the author of the encyclopedia, is the inextended edge that includes the whole extent of the universe, is the gesture of tracing the trait that circumscribes everything. Everything, I say. Because as soon as you try to say that something is outside the edge, that there is an outside of the encyclopedia, that there is something unrelated to the trait that for some reason is now working, is now in place, then you have just included it as excluded. Then you have made it the rest of something, and therefore the close relative of that something. So it is not a logical paradox what Borges entrusts to the letter H, animals included in the present classification, or the letter L, etc., unless we say that the logical paradox, this logical paradox, is the way in which the gesture, the tracing gesture, the taking place of a trait can make its way within the logical, within the edge of the encyclopedia, within the common space it has drawn. Then ontology resolves itself into ichnology, and ichnology, ichnos is the trace in Greek, and ichnology, the most important things, since there is no outside, and ichnology, since there is no view from outside, neither view from inside, but only another gesture, another event, another trait taking place, then ichnology resolves itself in an ethics. The trait that happens from time to time singular, or if you want, the singularity that time from time happens has no common space. It is true, no common space with other singularities, but because the trait is the common space within which every other singularity takes place, happens, is drawn and redrawn, recalculated. I could say it again and otherwise, and I swear one last time, singularities do not take place within a common space because they are the common space within which other spaces each time transit, precipitate, enfold, and unfold. Thank you.
No, many thanks to you, Federico, for this very inspiring contribution. You touched many elements, one of which is shaping up as the real problem we've been discussing for quite a lot, which is the relationship between singularity and negation. This has been a topic throughout.
Between singularity
and negation.
Between singularity and negation. Okay.
Yeah, because it's been
Okay.
quite an important topic for all of us. And also, I remember that I and Greg have been discussing a lot about a simple question, namely, what is the science of the singular? Because, I mean, henology is the science of the one, and meteorology is the science of the whole and of the part. And your proposition, ichnology, is a very interesting one. I'm also thinking about, I don't know how much it counts for your research, but the word trait, I relate it immediately to Paolo Godani's book on the metaphysics of singularity, which is also an interesting theoretical proposition that also focuses on the notion of trait, which I haven't been, which I started thinking about reading reading it.
I took the idea of the trait from Lacan.
So again,
from
okay.
The seminar 9 on identification, where Lacan works the Freudian notion of einziger Zug, the singular trait. The einziger Zug is the trait, and einziger is singular. The trait of the identification of the son with his father, so to speak, and to put it in Oedipian, in an Oedipian milieu. I tried to extract the idea of the trait, le trait, of which Lacan speaks in the 9th seminar, and to put it in a sort of constellation with the use by Lacan, always, with his use of the idea of yi, which is a Chinese ideogram, which means, as you already evoked the question, which means one, the one, or one thing. It is a numeral, it is the number one, and it is the one. And it is the impossibility to discern, to distinguish these three things. So this is the genealogy of my use of the trait, of the idea of trait.
That's great. Thank you for the reference to Freud, because this is also, we've been mapping German, so Einzel is also a very interesting distinction within the German language. So, but again, I'd like now for other people to weigh in. So please, if you are here on Zoom, you can just raise your hand, or, I mean, just start speaking, make yourself visible in some way. If you are on YouTube, I think Gregory will be so kind to read your question. So you can write it in the comments, and Gregory will read it out for Federico to answer. So the floor is
Just one
open,
moment.
please.
I take a piece of paper and I'll come back immediately.
Yeah, that's great. So we have some time to recollect ourselves.
So here I am.
There you are. So please, does anybody want to start? I think Gregory wants to start. Yeah, please, Greg, go on.
Yes, thank you very much for your very stimulating presentation. I want to ask you so many questions, but let me start with one. Let me start with an image, maybe an alternative image of a tree. We have this Porphyrian model of knowledge, as you mentioned, because we have this trunk that has the branches branching out. You also have when I moved to Sai-Kung, I live in Hong Kong. I noticed there were kind of trees that I never saw before and that didn't grow where I was from or in Europe where I lived as well. And these are Chinese banyan trees. So, and these banyan trees, they don't have only one center. They have many centers. There's many trunks. And so some people, and then they have aerial roots. So they have roots that in which it's the nutrients and even I think water is absorbed through the air itself. And some people have suggested that this banyan tree would offer a different model of knowing and being in contrast to this single trunk in which you have many different centers of, well, rather than just one. So I just mentioned this, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts about this. It's not really a question, but maybe even looking for models like this is not exactly what we want. But I just mention it also because of the framing of the discussion. I want to maybe ask a more substantial question about the absence of the common space. I've been reading Badu recently, who says the one is not, and also Marcus Gabriel, who I've been engaged with for some time, who says the world does not exist. And both of these people arguably emphasized multiplicities, that there is a multiplicity without, in a way, a one unifying them all. And I'm wondering to what extent is your very stimulating presentation here today, to what extent does it overlap or connect with those ideas that also seem to reject at some level a common space, and or the way that this Chinese encyclopedia, if we take it as a guide for thinking or a guide for being, if we, depending on how we want to think of it, would lead us in this direction. So maybe I start with this, and then I follow up if people don't have other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Thank you, first of all, for this botanical notion, botanical experience. I haven't seen this kind of trees. It's quite interesting that there are such trees in China. If I understand correctly, there are many trunks in this in what we could call one single tree. Many trunks. This has something already to do with the question you asked. Because I would say there is each time the one. It is not that there is not the one and there are the many. It is that there is at each time the one and only one. Each time. This is the paradox. So there is each time the world, the universe, but there is each time a world, a universe. So it is not a matter of choosing between I will argue for the one, or I will argue for the manifold, the many, the multiplicity. Because if I say multiplicity, I already said a multiplicity. So I said a one, the one that that permits me to say the manifold of the one. So the problem is that there is each time a one, each time a one that is the only one, and there are many times in one times, and each of the many times is a one within which there are its many, within which there is its manifold. So there are, so to speak, many ones and many manifolds and a stratification. But this is what I say. So this is another one which is saying this, which is experiencing this, which is realizing this in a strong sense of the word realizing, which is producing this unity multiplicity. And this I'm doing. You are doing the same thing. You also are the only one. We all are the only, but also this chair is the only one of its own universe within which all the other only ones, plural, are inscribed.
So if I may follow up, it's clearly what you say is not, it's very far from the Badu and Gabriel, which I'm happy to hear. Let me follow up. Let me follow up as well with this much more exciting. And I had the inclination from your talk that this is the direction you wanted to go, but I wanted to clarify that if you'll allow me to translate into my own language for a moment. For me, this is very similar to saying the absolute is the relative and the whole is the element of the whole. And this means a proliferation of the whole. And it means a kind of a truth of contradiction. So it's not that the one is not, but that it is, and it is not other, as Cusanus would say, non-aliud, not other than any relative being. So Cusanus has this wonderful non-aliud, non-other, right? Mm-hmm. So the chair is one, the absolute is not other than this, not other than that. And they have these, these beautiful, this Eckhart and Kuza have this beautiful image of the circle whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. And I'm wondering whether what you're saying maps onto this, and if not, why? What, because one might be confused and think you're just a Neoplatonist of some kind with a different language. Now, for me, this wouldn't be a problem. I'd be very happy to hear that. But I think perhaps there is because again, I'm not immersed in the Lacan or psychoanalysis, so I'm very interested in how, especially in the employment of the notion of tracing and this way in which you presented these ideas, how they may connect with those images of circumference and center. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then I'll stop asking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gregory. I could simply say I totally agree with you. It wouldn't be so amusing, so I can add something, but I totally agree with you, and I have no problem to declare myself as a Neoplatonist. I am. I'm not a specialist. I'm not an historian of Neoplatonism, but I am a Neoplatonist in action, so to say. And some years ago, 5 years ago, I wrote a book about Lacan. And my idea, my project was to show that Lacan can be read as a Neoplatonist.
I see.
And there are some texts which allow this interpretation, namely the Seminar 19, which is about the one, which is all about the one, and within which he says at every page, I'm taking this idea of the one from a tradition, he's speaking to some known philosophers, so he has to explicit something that is quite obvious. I'm drawing this idea of the one from the Neoplatonist tradition, from someone who has written a dialogue whose title is Parmenides, from Proclus, from Plotinus, and so on. So my idea was to put together the Freudian idea of the Einzigartzug and the Chinese idea of the yi, which was Lacan's project in the Seminar 9, with what Lacan called the one, named as the one in Seminar 19. So it is 5 years or 10 years I'm trying to revitalize, so to say, the Neoplatonism and some features, so to say, of the Neoplatonism within contemporary philosophy and psychoanalysis and biology. We can use this kind of treatment of the coincidence of the one and the many in many directions and many fields of knowledge, practices, and so on. So I also totally agree with your use of the lexicon and the images of Nicolas von Cues. I don't know in English. He is Nicolas of Cues. Is this the English translation of his name?
Nicholas of Cusa is usually
of Cusa. Okay.
But Cusano is also
yeah, because in Italy he is the Cusano, the one from Cusa.
Yes.
So, and in particular, I also would have chosen the same expression you extracted from his works, the non-aliud, the non-other, which is not the same, which is not the other, and this is a way of saying it is not the one and it is not the many. It is what permit to the one to be the one and to the many to be the many of that one. the non-aliud is what I or Lacan calls the trait, or the Chinese, but the Chinese tradition, not the Argentinian pseudo-Chinese encyclopedia of Borges, but the Chinese tradition calls yi. And there is an enormous work within Chinese tradition about this idea of a graphic ontology, which is not an ontology, which is an ethic, which must be an ethic, because there is no consistence to be known, to be studied, but only inconsistence to be frequented, so to say. So it is an ethic, but it is an ethic of traits, of yi. It is a graphic conception of the universe, and it is the idea that the universe is each time one trait, namely one, a yi in action, a manifold which is folded and folding within the yi. And this resembles, is very near, anyway, is very near to Plotinus, to the Greek Neoplatonic idea of the one, which is, if you read the text of Plotinus, you always stumble upon this expression, the, so to say, one. It is not the one. It is never a theory of a one, of the one, because he knows that the one is never in front of you, philosopher who are speaking about the one. The one is the condition operating which permits to speak of the one, which is also, so to speak, necessary, so to speak, the one, the pseudo one. The one is always a pseudos. The true one is never the true one. But this is a almost literal quotation from the Tao. Yes. The Tao about which you are talking about is never the true Tao. Yes. The Tao is never the true Tao. The Tao also is always a pseudos. So there is an ethic of the pseudos, which is very interesting, an ethics of the simulacrum. The old, not so old, but the last Foucault, he was not so old, le pauvre, but the last Foucault worked on this idea of an ethics of pseudos, when he tried to interpret an enigmatic sentence, an enigmatic motto of Diogenes, the cynic. And that sentence was, in Greek, parakaratein to nomisma. A sentence you could translate in many ways, and it is never the good translation, the good one. It is the good translation is always another one, exactly as the one, which is never the one, the true one. Because you could say you must make false coins. Parakaratein to nomisma could be translated, could be interpreted as an allusion and an information about the profession of Diogenes' father, or maybe of Diogenes himself, who was someone who made fake coins, fake money. But you could also translate this para karate into nomisma as deforming the law. Nomos, nomisma nomos, and para karatein, the para and the character and the nomos of the nomisma. So you have not to obey the law, you have not to suspend the law. Diogenes and Foucault are not Agamben. You have not to obey, you have not to suspend the law, you have to para karatein, to nomos, the law, to nomisma. You have to make a grimace to the law, toward the law, and of the law, and you must frequent the law. But you can also use this kind of theoretical material, of conceptual instruments in biology, and it is very interesting. Because you could interrogate, you could question the relationship between the DNA, the ADN, and the phenotype as a relationship which is not a transcription of an original and the execution of a program, of something that is already written, that has already been written, but the creation of what will appear as being already written, but after the execution. And this is the most contemporary idea of the relationship between ADN and phenotype.
Interesting.
And so to speak, the ADN is never the ADN. You could say the very same thing about the writing of the living, about the writing of God, and about the relationship between the universal and the particular, between being and entity.
Very nice.
Thank you, Federico, for this articulate answer, and thank you, Greg, for the question. Can you hear me well?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, perfect. No, sorry, because I have bad connection. If there are other questions, I do have one, which is related to, yeah, Greg.
There's a question on YouTube. Do you want to?
Oh, please go on.
Do you want me to read it first and then you ask your question, or do you want to go ahead? It's fine either way.
Yeah, please give priority to YouTube. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Sorry, Alex. Okay. The question is by Federico Popoli. This is so interesting. A provocatory question. You say that Lacan can be read as a Neoplatonic author, but in your opinion, how Lacan would react if he could at this statement? So the question is, how would Lacan react to your claim that Lacan can be read as a Neoplatonic author? That's the question.
I hope he will be happy. And I sincerely think that he would understand that is almost, in any way, it is a possibility of reading his texts and seminars. And the more he becomes old, the more he becomes Neoplatonic and immanentist. He was a Hegelian thinker and a thinker of the negative at the beginning in his youth. And the more he's become older, the more the negation, it is not that negation becomes marginal, but it is interpreted as a consequence, as a way of apprehending the movement of the event. The negation is just a way of writing the affirmation. It is an instrument, the negation. It is not the nature of the process. It is an instrument through which we can notate, we can write down the process. Because writing fixes the process. And after the writing has fixed the process, in order to describe the process, the progress of the fixed process must negate the fixed thing, which is a product of writing. So negation is the product of a product of writing, is a consequence of the testamentary, Derrida would say, nature of writing. It is not by chance that every oral culture ignores totally the negation and has other ways of giving account of differentiation, of multiplicity. And I would add, not only every oral culture, but every written culture which is not alphabetical. Because Chinese culture is an enormously ancient culture of writing, but they draw, they don't write alphabetically, they don't analyze alphabetically, they don't use writing as a fixing procedure. They use writing as a, how would I say, as a cinematographic writing, as a cinematographic procedure. So they don't need the negation in order to make the process move. The process is already moving by itself, and writing also is already and always moving by itself without the need of an external coup de théâtre, which is negation. Alessandro, maybe you were saying
If
some.
I may, because my question was exactly about writing and alphabetical writing in particular, because your talk reminded me of a passage in one of the masterworks on the topic, which is Orality and Literacy by Walter J. Ong, where Ong does this experiment. He talks about, maybe I can share an image which will make everything easier. Can you see the image?
Yeah.
Perfect. So at a certain point in Orality and Literacy, he says there is a very good way of distinguishing between an oral and an alphabetic culture. In an alphabetic culture, if you show these four images and you ask which one does not fit with the others, everyone will respond the piece of wood. The third image does not fit with the other ones, because an alphabetic culture is, so to say, categorical culture, is a culture based on categories. So the idea is these are all instruments, and the third image is not an instrument. Whereas this is the example made by Ong, an oral culture is a situation related culture, which means they will probably say, no, the hammer does not fit with the other images, because you cannot use, it doesn't make any sense to use a hammer with wood. Whereas, of course, you can use a saw and an axe in order to cut a tree. And I was wondering, in a way, your talk made me think that what is in play here is not simply the difference between two different ways of categorizing the word, so to say, of articulating differences within the word, but much more radically, a difference between categorical thinking, so a way of thinking that, so to say, articulates objects through differences and through kinds of substances, so to say, and a way of thinking that maybe in your language, I don't know whether you agree, is related to events and does not really think in terms of categories. So maybe your talk could also be a good way to even radicalize what Ong says about the difference between an oral and an alphabetic culture. I don't know whether you agree, but that really came to mind.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro. I would add, but this is really not a philological note notation, but a sentimental notation, that the example is not by Ong. Ong cites the example from Alexander Luria. And Alexander Luria, the greatest psychologist of Russia in his time, and he had been sent among the peasants in order to understand how the people, the mythical people, thinks. And Ong draws this idea from Luria, and Luria, when he tried to understand the way of thinking of the peasants, asked them, could you please define the wood, the sow, and so on? And the answer was invariable. We cannot define the wood, the sow, and so on, because these are the same thing. Mm-hmm. And this is the first cue for Luria to propose this idea that within a oral and pragmatic culture, we have not an analytical distinction in objects, but a synthetical apprehension of a plexus, a pragmatic plexus, mm-hmm. a comprehensive figure of the world. And it is only when you take the children of these peasants and you put them in a school and you teach them to write and read, that they come back home and distinguish what for their father is not distinguishable. Mm-hmm. So the question is political also. It is not a question of we have the possibility of a Western encyclopedia or a Chinese encyclopedia. And maybe the second one is more true, so to speak, than the first one. But it is maybe both are true or both are false. But the one is one and only thing with one political way of being in the world. And the other is one thing with another politic of experience, so to speak. The ground is what I try to say when I said this is not a ichnology, namely a theory of there is ichnos and not on, not to on. Mm-hmm. It is an ethic and an implication because there is no external world, all is inside the encyclopedia and so on. We can say also it is not only an ethical, it is a political question. What encyclopedia do you want to, or could you imagine? Your history, your instruments, your writing, your language, and so on, permit to establish. That encyclopedia is a politics, is a politics of experience, is a way of subjectivation and of objectification of other subjects and of alliance or not alliance among subjects. Encyclopedia is always a political issue. And it is absolutely evident with Luria, because it is absolutely declared the political nature of his mission. He didn't want to study the ways of thinking, but the value of one way of thinking, and the idea of a people, what could be a people?
Yeah.
What could be the subject of history?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
So,
Yeah.
is there any other question?
Well, I could keep going, but I don't want to keep us late into the it's very, very interesting discussion. So
I hope this was an occasion to get you to know each other. So I mean, maybe this could be a start for an ongoing discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be for the next time. If you want, I will send you a paper in which I discuss the question of Luria.
That'd be great, thank you. Because I completely forgot
of distinguish the wood, the hammer, and so on.
Yeah, no, but thank you, because it was I completely forgot the reference, which was explicit, of course, in Ong's book, but it is very interesting. Maybe a question that one last question before freeing you of our curiosities. Maybe this need to state that every encyclopedia is an ethics, or is implicitly also a way of life, a way of doing politics, of living politics, etc., etc. The need to state and to emphasize it comes from the fact that what you called, and what maybe we could call the alphabetic way of doing an encyclopedia tries to detach these two elements. So that tries to state the opposite on the explicit level, to say, no, listen, this is just how things are. This is not related to how we behave, to how we live. This is only theory, so to say. So maybe, I mean, you need to emphasize this, because the alphabetic encyclopedia is the only encyclopedia that refuses this ethical dimension of I don't know, of articulation of language and reality and knowledge, in a way.
Yes, I would say so. I would say our writing, our alphabetical writing, and our implicit or explicit metaphysics has inscribed within his structure and way of functioning the temptation to cancel its practical nature, its political nature. And we are the only ones that that live in the illusion that knowledge is about truth and not about happiness. and not enough about struggle, not about war, namely a way of making people happy or in a struggle, in a war. We European, we Greek, Hebrew, Christian, the only ones in the world that cultivate the illusion that knowledge is neutral. And this is the very product of the alphabet. Yeah. If you write within other systems of notation, you can't cultivate this illusion, this violent illusion. It is the most violent illusion you can cultivate about knowledge, about philosophy, about politics, about economics.
Yeah.
This is the very violence of the alphabet. What Derrida calls the violence of metaphysics is not the violence of metaphysics, is the violence metaphysics inherits from the alphabet.
I completely agree. So thank you. I was really happy to be able to retrace this also this discussion in your talk. Very well. I think we are almost out of time. So
okay.
Federico, if you have a last word, if you please, the floor is yours. If you have anything else to say, we'd love to hear you.
It will be for the next time. Thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting you, all of you, and so it is just a beginning.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, thanks so much for coming and for giving the talk. Maybe I send you further questions because it's getting late here. I want to ask you about contradiction, and I want to ask you about Worf and other related issues regarding language and thought. So I'll just bother you virtually that way later.
Okay.
Very good.
It will be a pleasure. It will be a pleasure.
Well,
thank you very much.
It was really great. Thank you, Federico. Just a reminder, next week we will have the last session of our seminar with Gaetano Chiurazzi, who's also here. So thanks for participation in our seminar series. And again, thank you, Federico, so much. Thanks, Greg. Thank you all on YouTube and Zoom, and see you next week.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye. Thanks so much. Cheers.